Good evening and welcome to this City Talks Forum hosted jointly by the University of Tasmania and the City of Hobart. Firstly, as a reflection of both of our organisations' recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the City and the University wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Palawa people of Tasmania as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're meeting tonight. And we'd like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Anna Reynolds. I'm the Lord Mayor of Hobart. I'm very pleased to be here tonight and moderating the discussion. I'd like to acknowledge our very special guest this evening, the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull AC, the 29th Prime Minister of Australia. A warm welcome also to our expert panellists, Dr. Lisa Stafford, who's an adjunct senior researcher with the University of Tasmania, and Darren Davis, who is the lead transport and land use specialist with the global consulting firm Stantec and based in New Zealand. Also a welcome to Professor Jason Byrne, who is stepping in for the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Tasmania, who has been unfortunately called away for this evening's discussion, and he'll be wrapping up the discussion at the end of the night. So the City Talks Forums of Hobart are a way that the University and the City are bringing to the community a public forum to engage in inspiring and interesting ideas for innovation for our city as Hobart grows. And we're really pleased tonight to be talking about Hobart at a crossroads. Can we be a small city with big transport choices? But just a few housekeeping notes to start. Your microphone, camera, chat function and raised hand function have all been disabled, so our speakers won't be disturbed. But we do encourage you to ask questions if you'd like on the Q&A function that is on your screens. You can ask questions anonymously, and we can't promise we'll get to all of your questions, but we will try to get to a couple. We'll also be conducting some audience polls during this webinar, the first of which is on your screens now. So if you'd like to participate, please feel free. And finally, this forum is being recorded. And so if you'd like to recommend the forum to your friends afterwards, they can watch that later on YouTube and SoundCloud. So onto our forum, and I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull AC, who was Australia's 29th Prime Minister and was in the role from 2015 to 2018. As Prime Minister, he reformed personal income tax, education and childcare systems, and oversaw the legalisation of same-sex marriage, and announced and was involved in the construction of the Snowy Hydro 2.0, which was a new pumped hydro scheme and one of the biggest, or the biggest in the Southern Hemisphere. As Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull was also a very strong advocate for cities policy, and as part of this introduced the Australian City Deals program, which is one of the reasons we invited him to be part of this forum tonight. Before entering politics, Mr. Turnbull had an international career in law and business and the media, and since leaving politics, he has resumed his business career as an advisor to many Australian technology businesses. He also speaks and writes on a wide range of issues of great interest to the Australian community. So I'd like to hand over to Mr. Turnbull now to share with us some of his insights into the choices that cities like Hobart have to face when it comes to transport and options that are there in the future as cities grow. Thank you, Mr. Turnbull.
Well, thank you very much, Your Worship. It's always good to be introduced by the Lord Mayor. I have to say, the only achievement I ever had in local government was to be the first man to be Lady Mayoress of Sydney, when my wife Lucy was the first woman to be Lord Mayor. And Lucy is, the great urbanist in the family, and she's until recently the Chief Commissioner of the Greater Sydney Commission. But we do both share a passion for cities. The City Deal plan, or the City Deal program, which is now rolled out in many cities and parts of cities like the Western Sydney City deal, but built on this proposition, which is that historically we have had the three levels of government often seeking to achieve similar good things, but effectively operating like ships in the night, sometimes going in the same direction, hopefully not too often crashing into each other, but very rarely being properly coordinated. And so the city deal proposition was very simple, which was simply that we should get the feds, the state, local government, and other big stakeholders, as in like the University of Tasmania, for example, relevantly in Tasmania, to sit down and say, what is it we want to achieve? What are we trying to do here? Let's work together. Let's agree on what we want to do. Let's, have a steering group that coordinates it and come back and review it, our progress and so forth. And that, I think the city deals, I'm really pleased the city, because it was a particular passion of mine. I don't think anyone else would have introduced it, frankly. But I'm glad to see that it survived my departure, which is good and is continuing. So I'd be very interested to hear tonight how you all feel the Hobart City deal is going. That sort of had its origins in an MOU, and I signed with Will Hodgman, or actually I think initially, in fact, the acting premier quite some years ago. Look, in terms of transport, I'll just make a couple of points about transport. I have always had a passion for public transport, mass transit, and I've always had that. I remember when I was an investment banker, there was I bumped into a guy called Carl Scully, who was the Labor Party Transport Minister in New South Wales at the time. And I paid Carl a compliment on the ferries. And he was surprised, and he said, what's a rich merchant banker like you catching public transport? Why wouldn't you do it? Why, surely you'd be in a limousine. And I thought he was pulling my leg, actually. And I said, oh, no. I said, I'm sure you get public transport every day. And he said, oh, don't be ridiculous. I've got a car and driver. I'm a minister. And it was interesting to me that people, it was a reminder of what Peñalosa, the mayor of Bogota, famously said, that the goal of public transport systems is not to be such. The goal should not be to make them available to the poor, which of course they should be, but they should be of a quality that the rich will want to use them. In other words, they've got to be, you've got to have quality mass transit. That is absolutely critical. And I think that, mass transit is so important. I mean, federal governments before mine very, very rarely got involved in mass transit. I remember John Howard's chief of staff, Tony Nutt, explaining to me once when I was urging the feds to do this, many years ago. He said, look, the problem with public transport is the federal government gets involved, they get their feet on the sticky paper, and they can never escape. And so they prefer to fund roads and stuff. Well, the problem is, if federal money is only available for roads, you're going to get a lot of roads. And you're not going to get the rail, heavy rail, light rail, metros, or anything like that, because the state will say, if our dollar into roads is going to be matched with, $3 from the feds, that gives us much better bang for our buck than just having an unmatched dollar going into mass transit. So we've got to recognise that our cities need all forms of transport, and public transport, mass transit, is a particular value. It's in value, I think, in a number of ways. The obvious one is it relieves congestion. I mean, if you wanted, you can't relieve congestion unless you can get cars off the road, and you can't get cars off the road unless you provide people with an alternative. It obviously is more environmentally responsible, particularly in Tasmania, where any electrified mass transit, of course, is running on hydropower. So, Tasmania is the clean energy capital of Australia, despite all the boasts of other states. It's also, I believe, very important for health resilience. One of the things I've been doing recently is working on a commission called the Reform for Resilience Commission which is an international commission with Michelle Williams, the Dean of Public Health at Harvard, and Jose Manuel Barroso, the former European president and Portuguese prime minister, and a lot of other people. And what we've been looking at and writing about and reporting on is the need to promote health resilience. Well, because the healthier the community are, the better you're able to deal with, problems like pandemics, if nothing else. Now, if your cities are not wholly car dependent, people are walking more, they are not as sedentary. That's why the healthiest city in America is New York City. You'd think, gosh, that's terrible. Everyone's living in blocks of flats, and there's, apart from Central Park, there's not a lot of greenery. How can that be healthy? Well, the reason it is because they're walking to the bus, they're going up and down the stairs to the subway. They're not just climbing into a car and climbing out of it when they get to work. The other final thing I would say is that I believe there is an enormous mental health aspect to public transport. Loneliness is a big problem. Depression is an enormous problem. We're only really starting to understand it. One of the good things about public transport is that you are with other people, and you're in the company of, and often engaged with, and often chat, if you're a convivial sort of person like me, invariably chatting to people that are not, your direct circle at home or at work. So I think those serendipitous encounters are very valuable. I remember, I've had so many on, I wouldn't go through them all, but I think it's really important. So I think public transport is vital for a modern city. It's vitally important from an equity point of view. If you have a car-centered city, in addition to all the problems I talked about earlier, you are basically discriminating against the old, the poor, and the young. And, that's indefensible. So that's why, as part of the federal city deals that, particularly the ones that were concluded while I was PM, there is invariably a public transport component. And I think that's just vitally important. A final point I'd make is, how do you pay for it? Well, you have to think about public transport, particularly rail, as a developer. Now, people will throw up their hands and say, oh my God, those property developers, they're the worst people, so you don't want to be like them. But the truth is that railways were historically invariably financed by real estate. That's why some of the biggest landowners in America or in Japan especially are railway companies, because linear infrastructure like that enhances the value of land. Transport-oriented development's been going on for a lot longer than the term transport-oriented development has been, frequently applied in discussions like this. And so you've got to basically say either you have value capture or you build stations and developments around your own land, but ideally you should put the transport infrastructure in first. The terrible mistake we make, and boy, we've done it in Sydney in a big way, and great credit to Gladys Berejiklian and her Liberal predecessors, if I can put in a teensy political ad here, for catching up on linear transport infrastructure in Sydney. But the truth is that far too often we've allowed suburbs to spread out with no planning. And then we say, oh my heavens, this is terrible. There's no one, the roads are inadequate and people can't move around. They can't get to work. They can't get to school or anything like that. So you need proper planning. And I'd give you as a good example of that, Lucy's, Greater Sydney Commission plan for the three cities in Sydney, the Western Parkland City, the Central City, Western Parkland City based around the airport, the Central City based in Parramatta, and then the, Eastern City, Harbour City, which is what we used to call people still call the CBD, but of course it's not central at all. It's on the eastern perimeter. But you've got to make sure you have in your cities access to people so that people can get access in a reasonable time. We would say here 30 minutes. In Hobart, I think you'd aspire to a lot less than that, to places to work, to play, to study, to shop and all those things. So there it is. I mean, I think public transport is absolutely vital, and I really wish you all the very best as you pursue your options there. I have had many discussions with Will Hodgman about it in the context of the city deal, and I'm sorry there seems to have been apparent decline in interest in it, but no doubt this webinar will revive it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. And I think you're okay with me calling you Malcolm from now
Totally.
on.
Everyone else does. That's
great. No, that was really interesting, and I think you really articulated very well some of the benefits of public transport. One of the questions that's come in that I think relates to your comment, which is the final sort of benefit you highlighted, which is the equity and the equitable access that public transport provides cities. Someone's asked here what's your thoughts on providing free public transport, and if that's a good investment for a state government to invest in free public transport or cheaper public transport. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I mean, there is no public transport system that covers its all of its costs from the fare box. So, and if you try to do so, you'll drive patronage away. Look, I think public transport, the most important thing is that it is affordable. I don't know that making it free is a good idea. Let me just make an observation here. There is a big issue in government planning of finances of a concept called additionality. Now, let's say we concluded there are 10% of the community are not getting public transport because they can't afford the fare because the fares are too high. But let's say pick a percentage. It's obviously not going to be a very high one. If the answer to that is to say we'll make public transport free, then what you're doing is giving a freebie to all the people who can afford it. And they're not going to get public transport anymore because it's already very affordable, as it is in most cities in Australia. So I think when you've got to be careful with measures like that, which are well-intentioned, but are probably better handled by direct transfer payments, by increasing unemployment benefits, disability benefits, family benefits, whatever. Target the people who need the money. I mean, one of the things we actually do pretty well in Australia compared to a lot of other comparable countries is means-tested benefits. And that's one of the reasons why our household income, disposable income, is much less unequal in its distribution than, for example, the United States or the UK. So but it should definitely be affordable, yes. But I think making it free, for example, when they made some years ago the trams within the, square mile of downtown Melbourne free, did that make more people get on the tram? I doubt it. I thought it was a grand political gesture, but you sort of ask yourself, or was that just essentially, handing a whole lot of revenue away and most of the people who benefited from it would have got the tram anyway.
Yeah, thank you. It may be the point that you use that as a tool to get some change of behaviour or achieve some other goal.
Sure.
And that's a good segue for me to bring in Darren Davis, one of our panellists, because he was telling me the other day that they do provide free public transport outside commuter times for pensioners in many cities in New Zealand, and I think there's obviously some social cohesion and access and equity goals to that policy. But I will bring in Darren because Darren was a key advisor in Auckland as it tripled its patronage on public transport. It had always been known as a very car-dominated city, and it was a 20-year journey, but Darren was there a lot of the way. Darren, one of the common things that we often hear in Hobart is, Hobartians love their cars, or Tasmanians love their cars. They're not going to move on to public public transport. And I'm just wondering, as someone who's worked in multiple cities, is that something that is unique to Hobart, or is that something you hear in a lot of other cities? And just also, could you talk us through what do you think were some of the key things that helped Auckland have that tripling of the patronage of public transport? What was it, infrastructure, or was it service changes that had the most impact?
Okay, well, thanks for that. There's a couple of interesting sort of questions in there. Firstly, I'll talk a little bit, just going back to the point you were making about targeting fare concessions. Very important to target fare concessions to need. And it's important because equity is an important element of providing public transport, as Malcolm said, for the very young, very old, and for people who, for whatever reason, choose or are not able to use private transport. So in Auckland and across New Zealand, seniors get free public transport after 9 a.m. weekdays and at all times at weekends and public holidays. In Auckland, one thing we did was to give kids free travel at weekends, and Auckland Council has underwritten that. And what that has achieved in Auckland is it's given parents a kind of a motivation to not be chauffeuring their kids around unnecessarily at the weekend by saying, well, the public transport's free. As for Auckland's journey, it has been quite a remarkable one. So in the early 1990s, we were carrying around 32 million people on public transport, which is not very much for a city that at the time was probably about 1.2, 1.3 million people. And at that time, the conversation in Auckland was all about the fact that nobody in Auckland will use public transport. They're addicted to their cars, they love their cars, they take their cars everywhere. But there are a number of different elements that we put together in a fairly comprehensive review of everything we were doing around public transport. And there were some enabling elements of that. So first one was integrated ticketing and fares, and I was surprised to find out today that that doesn't actually exist in the greater Hobart area, because there are multiple operators that have their own different ticketing systems. So you really want a seamless network, with one card, and preferably contactless, or even using your own sort of debit or credit cards to be able to use public transport very easily. So that was something that we implemented, and so what we implemented was something called the journey concept, that you're paying for a journey from your origin to your destination, irrespective of your mode of public transport, or whether it was a single trip or multiple trips. So you're paying for the journey, not for the trip. Second thing was we very early got into roads-based reallocation, and we've been quite aggressive about that. So the arterial roads in city centre, generally they were 4 moving lanes for traffic. We made one of those lanes into generally a 24-hour bus lanes in the city centre. The curbside parking on arterials in suburban areas was turned into generally peak direction, peak hour bus lanes instead of curbside parking. Those measures achieve really significant increases in patronage, and these are sort of and it sounds they sound like sort of quite dramatic measures, and at the time there was an adjustment period to them when they were implemented, and complaints of imminent traffic apocalypse appearing upon the city. Generally they would sort themselves out after a few weeks. Most fundamental elements, though, were an entire reform of the bus network. And my observation is that Hobart's network is extremely complex for a city of its size, often very indirect routes, a big focus on coverage over frequency. And even though there's a turn up and go element of the network, I call it a turn up and be confused, because there are so many different route combinations that are on those common sections of route. And you really shouldn't need to be extremely well informed. If you think of how easy it is to use a car or to get into a taxi, with the 13 Cabs app, or to order an Uber, versus the complexity of trying to get the hang of the public transport system, We also developed a rapid transit system effectively from scratch. There was a vestigial rail system on the verge of being shut down. We rebuilt that. We built the North Shore Busway in Auckland alongside the Northern Motorway. Both of those were enormously successful. In fact, the busway is the single busiest rapid transit route in New Zealand. So getting all of those elements right, but you really need to do them all together. And you also need to think about what happens at your primary destinations. And I understand in the city of Hobart that parking in parking buildings is free for 90 minutes. So there does seem to be an incentive to, you're giving people free parking and you're charging them to use public transport. And it seems to be a little bit of a perverse incentive. So I think my key messages are getting all of those elements right. And it's remembering that if you're thinking about future rapid transit, that's really great and important, but there's lots of basic elements that you can do with your bus system at the moment to make it work much better and become much more attractive and useful for a bigger range of trips.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. That's fantastic, and just I think that really highlights there is so much low-hanging fruit, isn't there, in targeting better services, better timetabling, reliable, affordable, comfortable. Some of those things that are often overlooked. We always presume there's got to be an infrastructure solution rather than a services solution. I've had a question in from the Small Business Council of Tasmania, and just very quickly, Darren, if you wanted to, is there anything in particular that could be done to incentivise people to catch the bus to work? Were there any sort of workplace related initiatives that you targeted either in Auckland or Wellington or Dunedin? I know you've done work there, which is a much more similar sized city to Hobart.
First thing is information is a key barrier to access to the system, and particularly when the system is quite complex. So a lot of workplace travel planning has taken place, and also a lot of leading by example. So Auckland Transport, which is the council-controlled organisation responsible for transport in Auckland, has its headquarters for its 1,600 staff. It has one parking space for its chief executive officer, who actually walks to work, and their car mode share is their public transport share, or their public and active mode, is around 92%. So very few of their staff. So the staff that are working at the organisation are by and large using public transport. Targeting the key institutions as well, and I gather that the University of Tasmania is moving into the city centre over time. So one of the things that we did in Auckland again was concession fees for tertiary students. They weren't as big as the concessions for some other groups, but there were 20% reduction of the adult smart card fares. We do surveys of students in our city centre tertiary institutions, and for University of Auckland, which is a very big city centre campus, its driver loan share is 3%. That's 3%. 70% public transport, 20% walking, a few percent on bike, and a few percent a passenger in a car. So targeting some of those key markets, tertiary students, we've obviously got a big increase in public transport use amongst seniors as a result of what we call Super Gold, which is free non-peak public transport for seniors. Been very important for that group for social inclusion and their really important role in volunteer organisations. So,
thank you. Thanks, Darren. We're getting lots and lots of questions, lots of interest. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to all of them, but I'll pick up some more of the themes after I've asked Lisa to give us some thoughts. Lisa, you're our local panellist as the Hobartian resident here tonight, and you've talked a lot about public transport being an essential service and should be seen as an essential service. We know that unfortunately at the moment the Tasmanian government spends the least per person per capita on public transport of any of the states and territories. What would you like to say to the Tasmanian government if you were able to speak to them about the value, the benefits of investing more in public transport?
Yeah, thanks, Lord Mayor. Look, I think there's multiple things we can do, and sometimes what happens is we get caught up in the complexities and can be overwhelmed from it. But I mean, as we've heard before from both Malcolm and Darren already, there's some things we can start doing really quickly. And unless we start doing that, then trying to bridge the equity issues that we currently see in Hobart will only keep getting worse. I mean, I always look at the Sustainable Development Goal. There's a clear target in 11.2 is that to provide access to safe, affordable, accessible, sustainable transport for all, and particularly focusing on children, women, older people, and people with disabilities. So, I mean, there's a long way to go, even to how do we have safety and actually trust and confidence in actually being able to get a bus? How do we actually then, we've had affordable comments already about ticketing, and that's particularly a concern if you're living in the middle to outer ring areas. It's quite expensive. We had a caller this morning talking about the sheer cost that was a barrier. And when we already have a lot of households in either rental or housing stress, it really impacts. And I think one of the things that continually forgets, and Malcolm highlighted this earlier, is public transport's essential for our economic development, our education, and social development. Like, they're all connected. And that's what we can lose sight of, and we have lost sight of that. For me, myself, yes, this has been a passion of mine for a long time in terms of making sure there's what we call spatial justice, making sure that we close those gaps so people can not just read a timetable and know how to catch a bus, because at the moment that's really difficult based on the information we currently provide to people. So for people with cognitive impairment or low levels of literacy, these are just straight up barriers that can be easily resolved tomorrow, from just thinking about how do we make our information accessible. We have so much information already in terms of spatial data, but we don't use it. How do we actually start looking at mapping our footpath connectivity to our bus stops? How do we start addressing that? Safety is a huge concern. We just know in winter here, our experiences between winter and summer is quite different. And women's safety is one of the critical importance that we need to make sure. Lighting, if you can't actually walk safely to a bus stop and be at a bus stop and feel safe, are you going to use it? There's been so many studies already that have talked about these issues. The other thing is, and not just women, I know men are caregivers as well, but we know predominantly women are the caregivers, and they have to do multiple complex transport routes. So are you going to turn to public transport when you're having to drop the bus, do a bus run to school and then get into work? If that's not safe and also affordable and reliable, then, but there are ways we can do that. And the information's there. I think what we can get lost sight is actually putting it into action. And that's one of the things is, let's get some strategies and actions and start dealing with the low hanging fruit and showing what's possible. We've had a car culture for a long time. I'm originally from Queensland. I was fortunate in the 80s. I grew up in the middle ring suburbs where we had bus, I had train, and I rode the bike. My mum didn't drive, so I was a public transport user. I'm also now a power wheelchair user. So for me, driving's not an option anymore, unless you want to deal with me being unsafe on the road. So for me, it's really important. It's essential for me to participate in everyday life. And so is 26% of our population has a disability here in Tasmania, 1 in 4. 51% of our population are women. 26 or nearly 29% if we carry a 0 to 24-year-olds, or at least 23% of 0 to 19. Of our population of children and young people. So and then I think 20% are older people. So we have a huge population here that we should be prioritizing and making sure that we close these gaps in we call it the whole of journey experience. It's before you leave home, from your front door to your destination and return. That has to be seamless. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. And I think some of that needs to be factored in a lot earlier into subdivisions and new developments before we expand into areas. That some of the thinking around bus shelters and services needs to be a much more well considered than it is at the moment in Tasmania, certainly, and probably in many other places as well. I do have a question for Malcolm from the audience. Just a question about whether there's a need for a stronger national and a stronger federal transport policy. I mean, I can't actually recall whether there is a national transport policy at the moment, Malcolm. Certainly not one that necessarily covers some of the issues around the integration of city development and planning and public transport and roads and those sort of things. I mean, do you think there could be more done at the federal level just to really set some of those principles and take that leadership role on some of those elements, and so that it can trickle down to state and local governments?
Yeah, yes, but only up to a point. I mean, I certainly in the City Steel policies and my own urban policies, which I don't think, my successor has walked away from. They're not as enthusiastic about my priorities, but I don't think they've walked away from them, at least not yet. Look, I certainly prioritise mass transit and public transport, used it a lot, set an example, as Darren, rightly pointed out. That was an important thing to do, but also made sure we funded it. And that was one of the first things I did as Prime Minister, was contribute to the extension of the Gold Coast Light Rail up to Griffith University, for example. So and there's a lot of examples of this thing we did, particularly in Perth, and elsewhere. Anyway, I think the most important thing is that the feds no longer, at least the coalition feds, because Labor has funded mass transit intermittently, but the coalition no longer has a phobia about funding public transport. And that I gave that example of the discussion back in John Howard's day. So that's important. But I think every city and community is very different. And really we should not discriminate between one mode of transport or another. I mean, cities will need and this is why light rail is not better than buses. Buses are not better than metros are not better than heavy rail. I mean, all of these things, these modes of transport have certain characteristics, and you've got to make sure they work in the city that you're in. There tends to be a sort of faddishness. And everyone's talking about light rail or everyone's talking about metro. You've just got to work out the right mix. But the critical thing is, there was a question that I answered briefly on the Q&A a moment ago. Someone said, should the focus be on providing improved public transport or on educating people to use public transport? Well, the answer is, as I said, the former will deliver the latter. If you improve the quality and availability of public transport, then people will use it. I just make one other point, what Darren and Lisa both touched on, which is the discoverability of timetables. I mean, for example, in Sydney and a number of other cities in Australia, Trip View works really well. So, I can, in Sydney, wherever I'm going in the city, I can very quickly work out a travel plan, and, all of the, because this is very important with buses. I mean, trains and ferries are more reliable, but buses are sometimes late, obviously, but they're also sometimes early. So it's having that up-to-date real-time information is incredibly important. You've just, what? If you want people to use something, you've got to make it easy to buy.
Absolutely.
And so you've got to make public transport easy to get, and it's obviously got to be, comfortable and reliable and clean and all those things.
Yeah, thank you. And Darren, I wonder whether you'd like to comment. We have had a suite of questions in, quite a number of them do relate to light rail, because it has been a bit of a debate, not just a debate, but a project that's been very long time in the discussion. We do have an unused rail corridor already sitting there, which some people would argue is a gift that many cities don't have, to have the corridor already available. Have you come across this in particularly maybe some of the smaller New Zealand cities, a debate over should we invest in rail or buses, or do you have any thoughts about the choices there?
Yep, so Dunedin, which is exactly the same latitude as Hobart, but a couple of thousand kilometres to the east. Very similar conversation going on around the possibility for commuter rail, and I worked on a mode shift program for that city. And yeah, my thought on that was, yes, you want to retain the option value of doing that, but really good to focus on making the buses work as well as possible as your first step, because there's a couple of things that you want to do there. First, you want to build your existing public transport system, so you shouldn't be ignoring all of the things that you can do, because that builds the patronage that makes the case for investment in higher order public transport. The second thing is that once you have the higher order public transport in place, you want the bus to be an important feeder role to it, so you don't have to provide enormous park and ride lots at every one of your stations, because that ends you up in a situation of what I call COT, or car-oriented transit, where you need to have a car to access public transport, which kind of defeats the point. So other comment around Auckland and of possible relevance is to revive our rail system. We did what we called the Perth deal. Perth electrified its rail network at around 1991, and we basically offered to the Western Australian government that we would take the disused diesel multiple units off them for effectively, scrap value and ship them to New Zealand. By doing that, we bought ourselves enough time to be able to get a proper functioning rapid transit system up in place. So we bought those diesel multiple units over. We did a bit of work on the Auckland network, and that investment, and it was a very small investment, it was something like a $45 million commitment spread over 10 years to do that, saved rail in Auckland. But the key moves that came subsequently to that were a series of station service and frequency improvements, and most importantly, bringing rail back into our city centre in 2003. And then subsequently, we electrified our rail network in 2014 and 2015. But if we hadn't taken that very first step of, thank you very much, Perth, we'll have your cast-off diesel multiple units to as an interim option to demonstrate that rail could have a role in our city, we would never have got to the place that we got to now. And ironically, now that we've electrified, we've got all of our cast off interim rolling stock basically sitting in Taumarunui now, sort of doing not very much. We exported a few of them to Maputo in Mozambique, but yeah. So so the message there is, if you've got a long-term goal, think of the steps to get there, and those steps are about building of what you've got now, of the bones of what you've got now, and make that as good as possible. But think about how you get to that future state, and it might be more than one step to get there.
Yeah, thank you, Darren. Absolutely. And Lisa, I'm just wondering whether you've got anything to add, particularly about the light rail in Hobart, but also whether you can identify a particular city that you think is really doing a good job with its accessibility of transport at the moment in Australia or New Zealand. I mean, I think we often look to cities that are further away than are really relevant. But if there's a place you've highlighted or identified in Australia or New Zealand that you think is doing some good work in accessibility of transport?
Well, I have to say my old hometown, Brisbane, it grew up with lots of problems and similar barriers. There was a lot of negativity, but the bus rapid transport system has been just a game changer for Brisbane, and the patronage is extraordinary. And I think there's so much confidence. We have an excellent integrated system. The go-card is used. We've had really good champions. The former anti-discrimination commissioner, he led the way, Kevin Cox. And we've had champions there that have actually just invested in and seen through, even though there was a lot of negativity and challenge. We've had the rail system in place already in Brisbane, but the connectivity wasn't there. The moving between seamlessly, which is now offered through the bus rapid transit system, and for commuters. So I used to use train and bus, and the seamlessness, works well. And the investment that's been through that, not just in terms of the actual buses themselves, have turned to electric as well, but it's also the platforms and how they all work. But it comes back to that integrated system as well. You can easily, seamlessly just move between your two different modes, and it all makes sense, which is really critical. It's easy to use, and that's really important. So, yeah.
I think we're getting these themes quite a bit about the importance of leadership of organisations, large organisations, and leaders in the community, demonstrating that these forms of transport are valuable and that they're willing to invest in them and ride on them and promote them. So that's really important. I do talk to my capital city Lord Mayoral colleagues, and a lot of them are quite worried about the return to the private vehicle and a flight from mass transit post-COVID. I don't know who of the panellists might want to comment on whether they think we're moving away to a very different model for cities, or away from mass transit into the centre, and it will now be more decentralised and working from home, or whether there's still whether there'll be a bit of both in the future, but there'll still be the role of mass transit and CBDs. Who'd like to take that one on?
Maybe I'll jump in there. But I'll go back to sort of Lisa's comment and about Brisbane. Auckland's North Shore Busway is a direct copy of Brisbane's Southeast Busway. Don't be afraid to find a good idea somewhere and replicate it in your own place. We did a transit-oriented development in New Lynn. Subiaco, and the trenching of rail through Subiaco and the stitching of the two sides of Subiaco town centre in Perth was our role model for that. So we're quite happy to sort of pick up ideas from what we call the West Island, otherwise known as Australia, and kind of exporting it to the East Island, also known as New Zealand. So there's plenty of positive role models there around that. So the COVID recovery is an interesting situation, and one of the interesting effects you get from that is cities with higher portions of transit dependent people who need to use public transport have recovered much faster than the cities that haven't. So I suspect that the impact on Hobart will be much more muted, but we have sort of responded to that. We're sitting at around, I think, 75% of pre-COVID in Auckland, about 80% in Wellington. Dunedin, though, and in Dunedin, we introduced $2 flat fares for the entire network, and that reduced fares from the highest fare was $11.41 in Dunedin. So, and many people were paying $4.50. So, what that actually helped Dunedin get to a higher than pre-COVID patronage, because we found that in a city where the price of parking in the city centre was relatively cheap, around $6 or $7 a day, typically for surface parking lots on the fringe of the city centre, a bit more expensive in structures, that we needed to get to a situation where the real cost of public transport was cheaper than the perceived cost of driving, which is often parking plus a bit of petrol.
Yeah, thank you. Malcolm, I see that you'd like to answer a question about Hobart used to have trams. Is that one you wanted to tackle?
There's a couple of questions about complaining about the diesel buses. Look, I was actually just up at Hyundai in Sydney yesterday, and there's the team there are really, they're right into hydrogen fuel cells. That's a big priority in Korea. And they're very keen to work all over Australia. So I think, if I was the Premier or involved in the government in Tasmania, I would be definitely aiming to have hydrogen fuel cell buses. which are electric buses, of course, in Hobart or anywhere. There is a big opportunity for a hydrogen economy in Tasmania. You've got a lot of renewable energy. The whole, big idea of the Battery of the Nation plan, which was another one of my initiatives as PM, was that Tasmania has got this big hydro scheme, which has been historically neglected for quite a long time. It provides a fantastic battery, and you've got the world's best terrestrial wind, without question. So as anyone who spends time on the west coast of Tasmania will know, it's very windy. And that's an asset. So I reckon the way Tassie should be positioned, and I think the government gets this, Peter Gutwin gets this, you should be positioned as the clean energy centre of Australia. And part of that is the green hydrogen economy. As you know, I'm working with Andrew Forrest and Fortescue Future Industries, and they're seeking to do a big green hydrogen deal at Bell Bay. But this is, whoever you work with, this has got to be the agenda, and a big part of that, because seeing is believing, would be to have hydrogen fuel cell public transit. Now, the other thing in terms of light rail, I mean, if you've got an existing corridor, it's silly not to use it. I mean, that's what they did in Sydney with light rail. Of course, part of the advantage of light rail in cities is that it runs at grade. And so people can hop on and hop off. So if you've actually got a rail corridor, a permanent way, your light rail tram, or whatever you want to call it, will go a lot faster than it will down a busy city street. But of course, it's really more like a commuter rail experience. In terms of bringing it into the city on city streets, the trackless trams really should be looked at very carefully, because the biggest cost building light rail in cities is building that permanent way. And unfortunately, invariably, there's stuff under the ground. I bet there is in an old city like Hobart, Anna, that you don't know is there. You'll have plans that say there's a water main here, and in fact, it's somewhere else. Yes. I mean, when we were doing the NBN, oh boy, all of the records had so many flaws in them. In fact, one of the good things about the NBN was that they've essentially mapped a lot of the underground urban infrastructure for the purpose of rolling out that network. So I think the trackless trams, they're getting very big in China. Obviously the tram itself can't be as heavy as the tram, that runs on steel tracks. But nonetheless, I think it's a big opportunity in cities. So I would be thinking about that pretty carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is mentioned in our city deal. It's actually got a whole chapter in our city deal, but we are struggling to sort of get it off the paper and into Infrastructure Australia as a proposal. And I think the economic growth benefits and the housing, the uplift and the ability for it to attract real estate development is something that's really not quite been grasped as well as I think it should be, because the proof is in the pudding all over Australia, all over the world, that these kind of rail corridors can really drive an incredible amount of affordable housing, which we also, and medium density housing, which we need a lot of as well in Hobart. And I think, Lisa, you've said that you've ended up in a very far-flung suburb, not necessarily through choice, but through the cost of housing. So we are missing that opportunity at the moment. Absolutely.
I think a good thing to bear in mind is that distance is a temporal concept, not a linear one. So, if you are 1 kilometre away from me, but you're on the other side of a river and there's no bridge for 50 kilometres, that you're 100 kilometres away from me, perhaps, and perhaps, over an hour's drive. If you're 20 kilometres away from me, but we have a fast rail link, then we can cover that in 5 minutes, then you're very close. And so we've got to recognise that we have a housing affordability problem, and that's probably beyond this discussion. But one of the things about making housing more affordable is making more housing substitutable. And that, of course, means bringing places closer together. So if somewhere that had hitherto been 40 minutes away from the city, if that's the place where people want to be, and you can make it 20, well, you have made a whole lot of housing now substitutable for the housing that had hitherto been only 20 minutes away.
Absolutely. Now, unfortunately, we've come pretty much to the end of our hour, and I'm going to hand over in a minute to Professor Byrne just to provide some summary points and wrap up the evening for us. There are so many questions. We've got about 70 questions that have come in, so I'm really sorry to everyone that hasn't been able to get their questions asked and answered tonight. There's obviously a lot of interest, lots of lessons to learn, lots of elements to this this discussion that goes from planning to how do we actually just improve services and make the services of public transport more attractive to people and a wide range of people. But I am now going to sign off and say thank you to the panellists from myself, and hand over to Professor Jason Byrne from UTAS to provide some summary points to take us out for the night.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. Thank you, Lord Mayor. And what a wonderful session. Truly incredible, the degree of engagement here. Thank you, Malcolm, for your wonderful contributions as well, and Darren and Lisa for the excellent points that you've made this evening. So I just want to maybe pick up a couple of quick points to reiterate. The first message I got is that we don't need to try and do it all at once, that we can start through a series of steps. And sometimes this can be as simple, for example, as activating your bus network and making it work properly for you. You could use a corridor with buses first before you switch to light rail later on. The incredible opportunity that we have here to use, for example, the hydrogen economy as a way to retool our public transport network, as Malcolm observed. The key issues around equity and inclusion, and particularly important here, are the linkages with land use planning and the need for much better strategic planning across Greater Hobart, but also other cities like Greater Launceston. And that we can start some of this simply as activating, for example, our smartphones, and we have smartphone integration so we can track our buses, which means that information is no longer a barrier and we can see if the bus is on time or not. And other quick solutions and easy solutions, such as putting in place clear ways that would enable busways to work more effectively. The Northeast busway, as being the busiest rapid transit route in New Zealand, is particularly instructive. I'd like to just finish off by acknowledging that important connection between transport and land use planning, some of the hidden linkages about mental health and well-being and how critically important they are. And to reiterate, what a wonderful discussion we've had this evening. So my thanks again to the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull, our panellists, Dr. Lisa Stafford and Darren Davis, and our wonderful moderator, Councillor Anna Reynolds, Lord Mayor of Hobart. This afternoon's talk will be available as soon as a video and podcast via the University's Island of Ideas website is up, and you can have a look at that website. The entire City Talk series is also available via this site, and I'd strongly encourage you to catch up with these excellent talks, not just this one, but the other ones in the series. And finally, I'd like to conclude by thanking you all for your amazing questions, your wonderful engagement with this critically important topic for the future of our cities in Tasmania, and to wish you all a safe evening. Thank you.